I would like to start with your project presentation, Juha Kakinen from Finland. In a way, it's the continuation of what we discussed on the panel before. And all of a sudden, things seem so simple. Of course, the first question that comes up to me is how do you convince the owners and the also the politicians, and how do you convince that it is important to invest now in good homes for the weakest parts of the society, also in respect to further costs? I think that's, how do you do it?
Well, you didn't put an easy question for me, because I think that you can't always convince everybody, politicians or owners of flats. So the best way is to show in practice that this works. And this we have been doing now for 30 years, buying flats. We buy around 100 flats each year. So they are small apartments mainly in the big cities. But we have also other housing projects, and it's not always easy to convince people, because there are a lot of prejudices against homeless people, as you can guess. But to show it in practice that it works, that's the only way, because we have had several projects where there has been resistance from the neighborhood for building some housing unit, and after a while they have realized that it's not a catastrophe that these people who used to be homeless are living here. So we have been developing also a form of work we call environmental work, which means that when you have a new housing unit, you start a dialogue with the local neighborhood before you start to build, and then when the building is ready and the operation starts, so there are, for example, social workers going around and discussing with neighbors, and if there are some disturbances, so we immediately try to solve the questions. So that's the only way to have an open dialogue all the time.
And after the housing problem is solved, what are the next measures to be taken? What are you also, for instance, connecting the inhabitants one with another? I'm thinking now of the arrival city idea, that there is already a network of people that can help at the place where people arrive. But in your context, the homeless get an individual flat somewhere and another one and another part, so they are not living together in one house. But is there some kind of a network that is also established, information network?
I think that it's important that you have alternatives. So we have this stock of scattered housing, which means that they are meant for people who need less support. They are people who are moving towards living completely independently. So they don't need that kind of network between other former homeless people. They have been provided the support services as long as they need, and then they can continue living in the same apartment as normal citizen, like everybody else. That's the basic idea with this scattered housing.
So we have also been talking, or you have been talking about large-scale movements, or on a global scale, a European scale. And I think there's one thing of you, Matthias Echanove, Franziska Wöllert, and Birte Nienaber, that is in common, and that is, in your researches, you draw some, you analyze global migration flows, and you draw some conclusions for it, and try to find spatial transformations. And well, maybe not concerning the figures, but I know that you have also been working about motivations and needs of people arriving in Germany and what kind of housing needs and wishes they have concerning to family housing. And I'm wondering, because on this large scale, your work seems rather abstract, and I'm wondering in how far the conclusions you draw could go into actual urban planning and regional planning processes. I mean, you are all experts on this large scale in a way. And how are your experiences? How can you transfer your knowledge into the actual planning of space? So maybe in your work this is also very obvious in a way, but maybe you would like to talk a little about that. Tell us a little about the measures that you draw from your work.
Yeah, it's very difficult, and also it's a bit early for us to really project what it would mean in terms of urban planning. But we are definitely seeing in the city, in Mumbai, different types of typologies emerging. Mumbai and other cities. In fact, we just right now we have in our office in Mumbai a young researcher from she's doing a PhD at Cambridge University. Shrayashi Das Gupta, and she's been documenting new housing typologies in Dhaka, in Bangladesh. Something that she's observed, it's a high-rise, a centrally located high-rise building, which acts as a dormitory for people who actually stay for about, like between 6 months or like 9 months and to 4 or 5 years. Single men, single women, or families. And as a typology, I mean, it doesn't exist. I mean, I've never seen this anywhere before, but it does respond to a kind of demand for people who actually need to first enter into the city, and then either they stay and they move somewhere else, or maybe they move back after they've got what they needed, whether it's some additional income, whether it's some education. And I mean, I think that maybe there's some interesting thing to look at in terms of the typologies which are emerging. The other thing is simply to start looking at the field, in a larger urban field, like in the urban as urban systems, rather than divided territories between the rural and the urban. Saying that actually the rural is almost becoming a subcategory of the urban, where the networks of people, flow of money, infrastructure, institutions have entirely penetrated villages on the village fabric. So it's really hard to, just in terms of purely conceptualizing this or making policies for rural development, to just say that, okay, this is the rural, they do farming. In fact, the activities have been urbanized a lot as people have moved back and forth, and the money that comes from the city is also kind of creating new type of urban economic activities within the villages. So, that's just, I mean, that's for Mumbai, and I think then conceptually maybe it would be interesting to apply some of, some concepts which can be developed anywhere else. I mean, like circular migration, which is now a big thing, to see what it does to a situation in Europe if we start really taking it seriously as something that could define how we relate to migration itself.
Nina, you have also been working on the large scale, at least on the European scale, looking at borders and small towns. And how far are you actually consulting planning processes now? Maybe you could give some concrete examples of your work, what you find out in your research, what are the spatial traces of migration, and on the other hand, what could be your input into planning processes that are also on a very large scale in time, not only in space.
Okay, so maybe I should first say some words about Luxembourg, because I don't think that all of you know about Luxembourg. And Luxembourg, which I mainly do research on, I mean, I also do research on the global scale, but always comparing it with Luxembourg. And Luxembourg has 46% foreigners living there, plus another 25%, which Germans would call people with migratory backgrounds. So we have really only very few and even decreasing numbers of Luxembourgers for the last 2 generations at least. We have also 3 different languages. So we have French, German, and Luxembourgish spoken at the same time. So it's not like in Switzerland, we discussed this in the lunch break, where you have a region where you speak French and another region where you speak German, but you have to know all these languages, because in one discussion we would just change between the 3 languages as nothing. And so we do have this kind of very huge increase of population due to migration, and it's not at all comparable with Germany. It's a huge increase. We had in 10 years an increase from 500,000 inhabitants to 700,000 inhabitants, and for the next 20 years it's seen to be 1.2 million. So it's really a huge influx of people, especially EU citizens, but also people from USA, and also refugees, but also this is not comparable with Germany, but it has the highest refugee per capita in Europe. So it's also quite a high number for this small country. And when this influx started in 2015, they suddenly realized there is no space in our reception centers. Why is there no space? Because in the 1990s, comparable to Germany, the Bosnian War, and people from Bosnia came to the reception center, and they never left the reception centers in 20 years. Why? Because there is no space, there is no housing. The housing market is completely overused, so there are 45,000 housing apartments are missing at the moment. It's increasing every week, every year, and social housing was not at all known. And what is this? Has huge implications on planning, because we need social housing for sure. There is now one first initiative to pay the rent, so the people should pay a rent up to 15% of their salary, and the other part of the rent is then paid by the state for those who are defined as being poor. And we have also then a huge increase of the people moving from Luxembourg to the so-called greater region, which means Rheinland-Pfalz, Saarland, the French Lorraine, and the British Belgium, Wallonia, which are the neighboring countries. And we have a huge increase of population there. You have a minimum wage of 1,900 euros in Luxembourg, and you have an average wage of 1,600 in Saarland. So this is also then problematic, because these people who are only gaining minimum wage in Luxembourg, they are quite rich compared to the people who are gaining average salary in Saarland, or in Rheinland-Pfalz, it's more or less the same. So also this is then a huge planning problem, because there are 140,000 people who moved from Luxembourg to the neighboring country. You need to have housing, you need to have schools, you need to have infrastructure, you need to have all this kind of things in the neighboring countries, not only in Luxembourg. So you can't think just of Luxembourg. In this kind of migration situation, the migrants coming to Luxembourg, but then moving on to the neighboring countries because they can't afford Luxembourg. So you have really this kind of huge planning impact for the whole region. Okay, I think that is the first statement.
Thank you for this insight in your research field. So it's all about, in a way, I feel, is the planning kind of always a step behind the migration flows? Are we always a little behind, and is planning in the end always too late and not actually meeting the actual direction of flow anymore?
Well, in fact, for a lot of European countries, I would definitely say yes, it's lagging behind. In Luxembourg, we have only a law for planning since 1999. There was no spatial planning before. And the cross-border planning, which is important here, is also completely lagging behind. They had the first meeting a couple of years ago to just find out, oh, there is something going on. The people already are moving, but the planners just figured out. And we have now established a lifelong learning course at our university to build up new spatial planners and hopefully get some kind of multicultural planning and also cross-border planning into their future ideas on how a concept could look like.
Franziska and Wellert, in how far could you implement your research on figures and demography to what is going on in Germany now at the moment in the big questions of what should we build, what kind of flats should we build? I guess that you are also involved in these planning processes, or at least asked for, tell us what we need now, what kind of buildings?
Well, my experience actually is more this, to talk about these big figures, but what I think what is very interesting to hear right now is what in many decision-making processes, we still think on migration as a process, a singular process, a linear process, so going from one point to another point once, and then people will stay there. But we know from migration research just for a long time now that this is not the case. Migration is very multitude. And as you has explained for Mumbai, this is our experience we see for other regions also. What you have told us about the experience in Luxembourg, and that it's a cross-border issue also, and that we cannot think only in one region, in one part, and in one movement. So that is actually also what I can see from my bigger figures, and I can tell you, yes, now we have a decrease of numbers right now to Germany, and we have this empty welcoming centers or whatever, but this will change again. We just have to see on the figures and see what is happening in other regions of the world. And if we talk about what does it need for integration, we know it about integration has to do something with relationships and social networking, and you need a family for that. Family, not family like parents, mother, and 2 kids or whatever, but family as the closest people. You're really the closest group. So these are the people who help you to orientate, to find a new way in a. Or to find your way in a new context. And if we just, let us say, some single persons who make their way, a very dangerous way to Europe, and we do not consider them as a part of a really network, integration will not happen. So if we make planning for these people, and we plan flats, single room flats because they're single men, for example, that will not work. Actually, that will not work. So if you want to talk about integration, let's talk about how these people interact in a social environment.
Juha Kakinen, you wanted to comment on that.
Yes, about this social integration. In Y Foundation, we had apartments for refugees already in the 90s. And we a year ago made a survey of how they have been socially integrated. What are their experiences of being integrated into Finnish society, and we could reach still some maybe 20, 30 people who have moved into flats in the 90s, and the reaction they gave to us was that what was the most important thing was a personal relation to somebody living in the same housing block or somebody in the working place. So there was, for example, one person who told that for his integration, the most important thing was a neighbor that greeted him, because that's normal in Finnish housing blocks, that neighbors greet each other.
I mean, just also to respond to this idea that are we always behind? I think it's not a bad thing to in a way be behind. We cannot anticipate, and if we were anticipating, we'll probably get it wrong. So I think the problem is not so much that we're behind, is that we're not equipped and we're not trying to observe and to recognize what is actually happening, how people are actually organizing. And this is one thing which I think is great about the exhibition Making Heimat, is that it's really taking architecture as an ethnographic tool, almost. Saying, okay, how are people actually organizing themselves? How are they structuring things? And if we're able to do this a bit more, and if that was, a bit, if there's a link between this kind of ethnographic observation and policy making, maybe that we could produce, structures, infrastructures, which would be a little bit more demand-driven, rather than just anticipating based on our own assumptions, which often turned out to be wrong because the world is changing fast and people are actually also adapting to complex situations.
Thank you. I would like to open up to the audience, Mark Derkesidis. Yeah, just a second.
I just wanted to add something to Mr. Echanova's presentation. My colleague and I, Tom Hullert and I, did some research about Europe, and we find exactly the same phenomena in Europe too. Also inside of countries, in Albania, for example, city of Tirana and the rural areas, and on a transnational level too. So the relationship between several European countries and Turkey or North Africa is pretty much the same. So it's even over the borders of countries. So if you go to Morocco, for example, the emigrants built with their remittances in a special, quite identifiable style even. So you see it immediately if this house was built by an emigrant. And that's quite an interesting phenomenon because that has grave consequences for urban planning, I think, in Europe. Because most of the urban planners actually think of the city still or treat the city still as if it were a container. But it has a lot of invisible suburbs, as you mentioned. And if you think about planning, that is very important.
There's another comment.
Hello, I just wanted to add something also to this issue because I think it's very interesting, also in regard of Luxembourg. About 10 years ago, I made this investigation concerned to Kosovo. We had the raids also in your presentation from Kosovo, mostly Albanians, and we have to figure out that we have inside Europe a very young state. It was after a NATO intervention into Serbia. Then in 2008, it declared itself independent. So we have now a nation-building process going on there. It's still under control by the EU and ruled by European Union. Before it was ruled by United Nations. They struggled for the independence. They have 1.9 million inhabitants. 90% are Albanians. The rest are Serbs and so on. From this 9.9 million inhabitants are about 400,000 living legally in OECD countries. Another 300,000 to 400,000, the figures are a bit fuzzy because they're illegal, are living also abroad. That's more or less at least 1/3, even not the half of the population is not in the country. And you have that effect that the capital of Kosovo, Pristina, has a lot of buildings appearing by migrants living abroad, usually through family structures. Only a part of the family is still living there. They invest there. They're creating new quarters and so on, but they're not living there. And on the same hand, we have the phenomena of migration that all these people, they don't spread all over Europe. They go to specific cities. Like in Berlin, for example, there are very, very few Kosovo Albanians. They're mostly centered in Stuttgart and in Hamburg. And so the mayor of Hamburg should be aware that quite an amount of his own population has a direct effect on the building boom in Pristina. So there's a direct connection. Nobody is aware of it. I mean, the countries itself, like Serbia or Kosovo or others, they have ministries or agencies for diaspora. They know that this diaspora has a big effect by the remittances on their development, so they are aware of it. But still, this process of exchange, which is going on, is not in the mind of the politicians, not locally and not on national level, and it creates a huge impact on also on German cities. Like we have in Offenbach, we have the figures here in the exhibition. We have this highest fluctuation rate in Germany. We have in the inner city where the high rates of migrants are, where we have 50% foreigners. We have a fluctuation rate from 20 to 25% per year. which means we have a lot of people, especially from Europe, which are coming in, going out all the time, which produces a really big question to the politicians, to the administration, and so on, how you should deal with that. You know, what does it mean? What does it implicate to urban development? And I think we have a huge agenda now as urbanists and architects, planners, and so on, to research more about and to think about more, to find more practical solutions on I think it's mostly a political thing, but it starts also to become aware of it. Thanks.
Thank you very much. I would like to take that as, is there one more? I would like to take that as a final comment on showing also the relevance of this last panel, the topic of this panel, to look XLarge, to look at the big scale and to put the finger on the fact that there is some work, also further research to be done, which will relevate new ideas on urban planning. I would like to, I guess that you are all ready for a coffee now, and I would like to thank you very much for this discussion and for your talks. I think this was a very inspiring last panel group of this symposium. Thank you very much to you.